The whiskey glass shattered against the saloon wall just inches from Catherine Riley's head, and she did not flinch, her green eyes blazing as she continued speaking about women's right to own property in their own names. It was the summer of 1878 in Cimarron, New Mexico, a dusty railroad town where most men believed a woman's voice should never rise above a whisper, and Catherine had just committed the unforgivable sin of contradicting the mayor during a town meeting about land disputes. The room erupted in jeers and catcalls, men rising from their chairs to shout her down, their faces twisted with outrage that this 22-year-old schoolteacher dared to have opinions on matters they considered far beyond her feminine understanding. Catherine stood her ground at the front of the crowded saloon, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her simple cotton dress dusty from the walk into town. She had come to this meeting because the new railroad expansion threatened to seize her small schoolhouse without compensation, and she refused to stand silently while her students lost their only chance at education. Her father had died 6 months earlier, leaving her alone to manage the small property on the edge of town, and she had learned quickly that in this rough territory, silence meant surrender. "You need to learn your place, Miss Riley," Mayor Hutchins bellowed, his jowls quivering with indignation. "No man wants to hear a woman carrying on about legal matters she cannot possibly comprehend. Your father, God rest his soul, would be ashamed of this unseemly display." The words cut deeper than Catherine wanted to admit, but she lifted her chin higher. "My father taught me to read, to think, and to speak truth regardless of who found it inconvenient. The law states that property owners must be fairly compensated, and I am a property owner, whether you find that fact palatable or not." The saloon descended into chaos. Women in the back of the room whispered behind their fans, their expressions a mixture of scandalized horror and grudging admiration. Most of the men shouted for her removal, their voices creating a wall of hostility that would have crushed a lesser spirit. Catherine felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in the months since her father's death, alone in the small house where his absence echoed in every room. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. A tall figure moved through the crowd, parting the sea of angry faces with quiet authority. Catherine noticed him immediately because he was not shouting, not jeering, not looking at her with contempt or condescending pity. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn denim and scuffed boots, a kerchief tied loosely around his neck. His blue eyes met hers across the room with an expression she could not quite identify, something that looked almost like respect. "That is enough," the cowboy said, his voice carrying without rising to a shout. The room did not quiet immediately, but heads turned toward him. Catherine saw recognition on several faces, respect on others. Miss Riley has every right to speak at a public meeting about matters affecting her property. Last I checked, this was still America, and we fought a war to ensure people could speak their minds without tyranny silencing them. "This is not your concern, Jameson Parker," Mayor Hutchins snapped, though his tone held considerably more deference than when he addressed Catherine. "The lady needs to understand that there are proper channels for grievances, and disrupting a town meeting with hysterical demands is not among them." Jameson's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his tanned skin. "I heard no hysteria, just a woman asking for the same legal protections any man would expect. Seems reasonable to me, and if her speaking up makes you uncomfortable, Mayor, perhaps you should ask yourself why that is." The tension in the room shifted, charged with new energy. Catherine watched this stranger defend her with words that echoed her father's teachings about justice and equality. She felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in months, perhaps years. Not gratitude exactly, though she was grateful. Something deeper, more complicated, like the first green shoots pushing through hard winter ground. Mayor Hutchins's face turned an alarming shade of purple. The railroad expansion is progress, and progress requires sacrifice. Miss Riley will receive fair compensation as determined by the railroad's assessors. This meeting is adjourned. He slammed his gavel down with unnecessary force and stalked toward the back exit, his supporters following in his wake like ducklings behind their mother. The crowd began to disperse, many of the men deliberately bumping past Catherine with muttered insults about uppity women and unnatural creatures who could not accept their proper roles. The few women in attendance hurried past without meeting her eyes, except for old Mrs. Henderson, who touched her arm briefly and whispered, "You are brave, girl, but bravery does not keep you safe in this world." Catherine stood alone in the emptying saloon, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation drained away, leaving her shaky and uncertain. She had accomplished nothing except making herself more of a pariah in a town that already viewed her with suspicion. The schoolhouse would still be seized, she would still receive whatever paltry sum the railroad deemed appropriate, and now everyone would know her as the troublesome woman who could not control her tongue. "You handled yourself well." The cowboy's voice came from beside her, quiet and genuine. Up close, Catherine could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weathering of someone who spent his days under the harsh New Mexico sun. He smelled like leather and sage and honest sweat. Most men twice your size would have backed down when Hutchins started throwing things. "I accomplished nothing," Catherine said, hating the tremor in her voice, "except ensuring that everyone in Cimarron now knows I am exactly the sort of difficult woman they suspected." Jameson shook his head slowly. "You stood up for yourself. You spoke truth to power. That matters, even when it does not change the immediate outcome. My mother used to say that the first voice raised in opposition is never the one that wins the fight, but it is the one that makes the fight possible." Catherine looked at him properly for the first time, taking in the directness of his gaze, the absence of judgment or mockery. "Why did you speak up for me? You do not know me. For all you know, I am as hysterical and unreasonable as the mayor claims." "Because you were right," Jameson said simply. "And because I have spent too much of my life watching people with power silence people without it. Also, you are not hysterical. Hysterical people do not cite legal precedent while remaining calm under assault." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his serious face into something warmer, more approachable. "I am Jameson Parker. I run cattle on the Triple Creek Ranch about 10 miles north of town. Catherine Riley, I teach at the schoolhouse the railroad wants to demolish." She accepted his offered hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip despite the calluses on his palm. "Thank you for speaking up, even though it changed nothing." "It changed something," Jameson insisted. "It showed everyone in that room that you are not alone, that not everyone agrees with Hutchins and his cronies. That matters more than you might think." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I know this is forward, but would you allow me to escort you home? That crowd was ugly, and I would feel better knowing you reached your property safely." Catherine's first instinct was to refuse. She had walked alone through Cimarron countless times, and she prided herself on her independence. But she was tired, genuinely shaken despite her outward composure, and the idea of walking alone through the darkening streets past men who had just called her vile names held no appeal. More than that, she found herself wanting to continue this conversation with Jameson Parker, this stranger who looked at her like she was a person rather than a problem to be solved. "I would appreciate that," she said quietly. "My property is about 2 miles east of town, past the old mission ruins." They walked together through Cimarron's main street as the summer sun began its descent toward the distant mountains. The heat of the day still radiated from the packed earth, and dust devils danced in the spaces between buildings. Catherine was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, the town's gossips already spinning tales about the outspoken schoolteacher and the cowboy who defended her. She could imagine the stories by morning, each more scandalous than the last. "How long have you been teaching here?" Jameson asked as they left the last buildings behind, following the rutted wagon road toward the mission. 3 years. "I came with my father when he took a position as the town clerk. He believed education was the foundation of civilization, that children needed opportunities beyond what their circumstances might suggest." Catherine's throat tightened. "He died last winter, pneumonia. It happened very quickly." "I am sorry," Jameson said, and the simple words held genuine sympathy. "Losing a parent is hard, especially out here where life can be so unforgiving. My father passed 5 years ago in a stampede. My mother followed 2 years later. I think her heart just gave out from missing him." They walked in companionable silence for a while, two people who understood the weight of loss and solitude. Catherine found herself relaxing despite the day's tensions, soothed by the rhythm of their footsteps and the cooling evening air. Jameson did not try to fill the silence with empty chatter, did not offer platitudes or advice she had not requested. He simply walked beside her, a solid presence that asked nothing in return. "I mean what I said in there," Jameson said eventually, "about you speaking your mind. It is beautiful, watching someone refuse to be diminished. Most people spend their whole lives making themselves smaller to fit into spaces other people carved out for them. You do not do that. You should not do that." Catherine stopped walking, turning to face him fully. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the scrubland. "You must know that opinion makes you unusual. Most men find opinionated women either amusing or threatening, certainly not beautiful." "Most men are fools," Jameson said bluntly. "They are so busy protecting their pride that they miss everything interesting about the world around them. I was raised by a woman who could outwork, outthink, and outshoot most men in the territory. She taught me that strength comes in many forms, and intelligence in a woman is no more threatening than intelligence in a horse, unless you are too stupid to appreciate it." Despite everything, Catherine laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her. "Did you just compare me to a horse?" Jameson's ears reddened. "That came out wrong. I meant that some men cannot see value in anything unless they feel superior to it. A smart horse is only good if you are smart enough to work with it properly. A smart woman is only threatening if you are too insecure to appreciate what she brings." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly flustered. "I am making this worse. What I mean is that I think you are remarkable, and anyone who wants you to be less than you are is a damned fool." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. No one had spoken to her like this before, with this combination of respect and obvious attraction. The young men in Cimarron who had courted her before her father's death had always made it clear they expected marriage to soften her edges, to transform her into something more manageable. Jameson looked at her like her sharp edges were exactly what made her worth knowing. "Thank you," she said softly. That means more than you might realize, especially today." They continued walking, and Catherine found herself telling him about her students, about the children of miners and ranch hands and shopkeepers who came to her schoolhouse hungry for knowledge. She told him about teaching them to read and write and calculate, about the way their faces lit up when they mastered something difficult, about her dreams of expanding the school to offer more advanced subjects. Jameson listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he actually heard what she was saying. In turn, he told her about the Triple Creek Ranch, about the 100 head of cattle he was slowly building into a proper herd, about the land he leased and hoped someday to own outright. He talked about the hard work of cowboying, the long days and longer nights, the constant struggle against weather and predators and market fluctuations. But he talked about it with love, with the passion of someone who had found his calling. By the time they reached Catherine's property, the sun had nearly set, painting the sky in brilliant purples and oranges. The small house looked lonely in the gathering darkness, the schoolhouse beside it empty and quiet. Catherine felt the familiar pang of returning to this space alone, to the silence that had replaced her father's laughter and conversation. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked, then immediately worried about the propriety of such an invitation. But Cimarron's opinion of her could hardly sink lower than it already had, and she found herself reluctant to say goodbye to Jameson Parker just yet. Jameson hesitated, clearly torn between desire and propriety. "I should not. Your reputation has taken enough damage today without people seeing my horse outside your house after dark." "People will talk regardless," Catherine said with more confidence than she felt. "If I worried about gossip, I would never open my mouth. Besides, it is just coffee and you walked 2 miles out of your way to ensure my safety. The least I can do is offer you refreshment before you ride back." He smiled, and Catherine felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Just coffee," he agreed. "And perhaps you can tell me more about your plans for the school, if the railroad's compensation gives you enough to rebuild elsewhere." Inside, Catherine lit the lamps and stoked the stove's embers back to life, acutely aware of Jameson's presence in the small space. The house felt different with someone else in it, less like a mausoleum of memories and more like an actual home. She prepared coffee with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from exhaustion or something else entirely, she could not say. They sat at her father's old table, drinking coffee from chipped cups, and talked for hours. Catherine learned that Jameson had taught himself to read from his mother's Bible, that he loved Shakespeare's plays and Mark Twain's stories, that he believed the West's future lay not in lawlessness, but in communities built on justice and mutual respect. He learned that Catherine had wanted to attend a teaching college back east, but had chosen to stay with her aging father, that she wrote poetry she showed no one, that she believed education could break the cycles of poverty and violence that trapped too many families. When Jameson finally rose to leave, well past a proper hour, Catherine walked him to the door feeling like something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world. This stranger who had defended her had become, in the space of one evening, someone who mattered, someone whose good opinion she valued, someone whose absence would leave a notable gap. "May I call on you again?" Jameson asked, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. "Properly, I mean. Not just escorting you home from town meetings, but actually courting you, if you would be amenable to that." Catherine's breath caught. It was one thing to share coffee and conversation with a kind stranger, another entirely to open herself to the possibility of something more. But when she looked at Jameson Parker, she saw none of the expectations or conditions that had characterized every other man who had expressed interest. She saw only honest desire mixed with respect, attraction balanced with admiration. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." His smile could have lit the darkness. "Then I will return Sunday afternoon, if that suits you. Perhaps I could bring lunch and you could show me around your property, tell me about your plans for rebuilding." After he rode away into the night, Catherine stood on her small porch and watched the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something other than grief and exhaustion. She felt hope, fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. The next days passed slowly, measured in the curious stares and pointed whispers that followed Catherine through Cimarron. The women's auxiliary canceled her invitation to their quilting circle. The merchant's wife loudly wondered whether someone so forward and opinionated should be trusted with impressionable children. 2 families withdrew their students from her school, citing concerns about her moral character influencing their offspring. Catherine bore it all with outward composure, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. But in private, the rejection stung. She had lived in Cimarron for 3 years, had taught these people's children, had attended church services and town socials, and tried her best to be a good neighbor. One act of defiance at a public meeting, and she was transformed into a dangerous radical, someone to be shunned and scorned. On Saturday, Mrs. Winters from the general store refused to sell her flour, claiming she had none to spare despite the obvious sacks stacked behind the counter. Catherine walked the extra mile to the Mexican market on the edge of town, where Senora Martinez served her without comment, but with sympathetic eyes that spoke volumes. She was carrying her purchases home when a group of young men blocked her path, ranch hands she recognized from the saloon meeting. They were not quite drunk but heading in that direction, and their eyes held a meanness that made Catherine's stomach clench. "Well, if it is not Miss High and Mighty," the tallest one sneered. "Still think you are as good as a man schoolteacher," Catherine kept her voice level. "I think I am a person with legal rights. Now please move. I need to get home." "Maybe we should teach you some manners," another suggested, stepping closer. "Show you what happens to women who forget their place." Fear spiked through Catherine's chest, sharp and cold. She was alone on a relatively isolated stretch of road, and these men clearly felt emboldened by alcohol and pack mentality. She opened her mouth to scream, hoping someone might hear and intervene, the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the tension. "Step away from her. Now." Catherine had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life. Jameson sat astride his horse about 20 yards away, his rifle aimed with steady confidence at the group of men. His face was hard, all the warmth she had seen replaced by something dangerous. "This is not your business, Parker," the tall ranch hand said, but he took a step back. "You made it my business when you threatened a woman on a public road," Jameson said coldly. "Now you have 2 choices. You can apologize to Miss Riley and walk away, or you can explain to the sheriff why you thought it appropriate to menace a lone woman. Though I should mention that Sheriff Clayton is married to my cousin, and she has very strong opinions about men who bully women." The ranch hands exchanged glances, their bravado deflating. The tall one muttered something that might have been an apology. Then they scattered, heading back toward town with considerably less swagger than they had approached with. Jameson dismounted and approached Catherine slowly, his eyes scanning her face with concern. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" Catherine shook her head, not trusting her voice. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she was shaking, the fear catching up with her body. The packages she was carrying slipped from her numb fingers. "Easy," Jameson murmured, catching her elbow to steady her. "You are safe now, I have you." The gentleness in his voice broke something loose in Catherine's chest. She found herself leaning against him, accepting the comfort of his solid presence while she fought to regain her composure. He held her carefully, one arm around her shoulders, the other still holding his rifle at the ready, in case the ranch hands reconsidered their retreat. "I was coming to check on you," Jameson said quietly. "I heard talk in town about people giving you trouble, and I wanted to make sure you were managing all right. I am glad I did." Catherine pulled back, wiping at her eyes impatiently. "This is my life now, is it not? Being accosted and threatened because I dared to speak my mind at a public meeting. Perhaps everyone was right. Perhaps I should have stayed silent and accepted whatever the railroad decided to give me." "No." Jameson's voice was fierce. He cupped her face in his free hand, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Do not let them break you. Do not let their fear and smallness convince you that you were wrong to stand up for yourself. You were right, Catherine. You are right. The fact that people are punishing you for it says everything about them and nothing about you." "They are making my life impossible," Catherine whispered. "Families are withdrawing their children from my school. Merchants are refusing to serve me. Those men just threatened me on a public road in broad daylight. How long can I sustain this? I am alone here. I have no family, no real allies. Maybe the brave thing would be to leave, to find somewhere else where I can teach without being treated like a pariah." Jameson was quiet for a long moment, his thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone. "If you want to leave Cimarron, I would understand that choice and respect it. But if you are considering leaving because you think you are alone, then I need you to understand something. You are not alone. Not anymore. I am here and I am not going anywhere." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. They had known each other barely a week, had spent one evening together, and yet his words carried a weight of commitment that took her breath away. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Jameson said simply. "I know you are brave and principled and intelligent. I know you care deeply about your students and your community, even when that community does not deserve your care. I know that when I am with you, I feel more alive than I have in years. I know that I want to keep learning everything there is to know about you, and that requires you staying in New Mexico." He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "Preferably reasonably close to the Triple Creek Ranch." Despite everything, Catherine felt herself smile. "That is quite a speech from a cowboy." "I read a lot of Shakespeare," Jameson reminded her. "Come on. I am taking you home, and tomorrow I am still coming for our lunch together. Those boys will not try anything again, and I will have a word with Sheriff Clayton about increased patrols out this direction." He gathered her dropped packages, securing them to his saddle, then helped her mount in front of him. Catherine had ridden horses before, but never like this, held securely against Jameson's chest as they traveled the road to her property. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, steady and reassuring, and gradually her own fear subsided. At her house, Jameson insisted on checking the property thoroughly before he would leave, making sure doors and windows were secure. Catherine watched him move through her space with competent efficiency, and something warm settled in her chest. This was not a man trying to control or diminish her. This was a man trying to ensure her safety so she could continue being exactly who she was. "I will be back tomorrow at noon," Jameson said from her doorway. "And Catherine, please do not give up. On the school, on Cimarron, on yourself. You are making a difference, even if it does not feel that way right now. Change is always hardest for the person leading it." After he left, Catherine sat at her table and let herself cry properly, releasing the fear and frustration and loneliness she had been carrying. But underneath those tears was something else, something that felt like gratitude mixed with possibility. She was not alone anymore. Whatever happened next, she would face it with at least one person firmly in her corner. Sunday arrived clear and bright, the summer heat already building despite the early hour. Catherine dressed with more care than usual, choosing her best day dress in deep blue cotton, pinning her hair up in a style that was practical but more flattering than her usual severe bun. She told herself she was being foolish, that one cowboy's good opinion should not matter so much, but her hand still shook slightly as she fastened the tiny buttons. Jameson arrived exactly at noon, riding up with a basket strapped to his saddle and wildflowers clutched in one hand. He had clearly made an effort too, wearing a clean shirt and vest, his hair combed back neatly. When he saw her, his whole face lit up with uncomplicated pleasure that made Catherine's breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said, handing her the flowers. "I picked these from the high meadow on the ranch. I hope you like them." Catherine buried her face in the blooms, breathing in their sweet scent. "They are lovely. No one has brought me flowers since, well, ever actually. Thank you." They spread a blanket in the shade of the ancient cottonwood tree that stood between her house and the schoolhouse, and Jameson unpacked a lunch that was both simple and perfect. Fresh bread, cheese, cold chicken, early apples, and a jar of lemonade. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing as easily as it had during their first evening together. Catherine showed him the schoolhouse, pointing out the worn textbooks and makeshift desks, explaining her dreams for expansion. "If I get fair compensation from the railroad, I could build a larger structure, maybe even add a small library. These children deserve access to books beyond the few primers I currently have. Knowledge should not be a luxury reserved for wealthy families who can afford to send their children east for schooling." "Have you thought about fighting the railroad's assessment?" Jameson asked. "Challenging their valuation in court?" Catherine shook her head. "I looked into it. Lawyers are expensive, and the railroad has far deeper pockets than I do. They could drag out litigation for years, and I would be bankrupted long before any resolution. The practical choice is to accept their offer and rebuild as best I can." "Practical, maybe, but not just," Jameson said thoughtfully. "And you strike me as someone who cares deeply about justice." He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I have some money saved. Not a fortune, but enough to retain a decent lawyer for at least the initial proceedings. If you are willing to fight, I would be willing to back you financially." Catherine stared at him, shocked. "Jameson, I cannot possibly accept that. We barely know each other, and you are talking about risking your savings on a legal battle we might not win." "We know each other well enough," Jameson insisted, "and I am not proposing this out of charity or pity. I am proposing it because I believe you are right to stand up for yourself, and I have the means to help. Besides, this is not just about you anymore. If the railroad can seize your property without fair compensation, they can do it to anyone. Small ranchers like me, shopkeepers, farmers, anyone without the resources to fight back. Someone needs to draw a line. Might as well be us. Us." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity and faith implicit in Jameson's offer. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Jameson reached across the blanket, taking her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip gentle but firm. "Because I think you are extraordinary. Because I admire your courage and your principles. Because I believe you are fighting for something that matters. And because, quite honestly, I am falling in love with you, and I want to be the kind of man who stands with the woman he loves when she takes on impossible fights." Catherine's heart stopped, then started again with painful intensity. "You cannot possibly know that. It has been less than a week." "I know what I feel," Jameson said quietly. "I know that I think about you constantly, that I find excuses to ride into Cimarron hoping to catch a glimpse of you, that the idea of you leaving makes my chest hurt. I know that when I watched those men threaten you yesterday, I was prepared to do whatever necessary to keep you safe. Maybe that is not love yet, but it is the beginning of it, and I am not afraid to name it." Catherine's throat felt tight, full of words she did not know how to speak. She had spent so long being strong and independent, managing her life alone, that the idea of letting someone in felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But looking at Jameson's open, honest face, seeing the truth of his feelings reflected in his eyes, she could not deny her own growing attachment. "I am afraid," she admitted softly, "of disappointing you, of losing myself in someone else's expectations, of letting myself need you, and then having you decide I am too much trouble after all." Jameson lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I cannot promise I will never disappoint you or make mistakes. But I can promise that I will never ask you to be less than you are. Your strength, your voice, your unwillingness to accept injustice, those are not flaws I want to sand away. They are the things that make you remarkable. If you can trust me with your heart, I will guard it carefully. And if you will let me stand with you in this fight, I will count it an honor." Catherine felt something break open inside her, some tight defensive wall she had been maintaining for longer than she realized. She squeezed his hand, blinking back tears. "I think I am falling in love with you too." "It is terrifying." Jameson's smile was bright enough to rival the New Mexico sun. "Terrifying, maybe, but also good, yes." "Also very good," Catherine agreed. And then she was laughing through her tears while Jameson pulled her closer, his arms coming around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. They spent the afternoon making plans. Jameson knew a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man with a reputation for taking on cases against powerful interests. They would travel there together next week, present the facts, and see if he was willing to represent Catherine's case. If the railroad could be forced to acknowledge proper property values and compensation, it could set a precedent that protected other small landholders from similar seizures. As the sun began its descent, Jameson prepared to leave, though Catherine could see the reluctance in every movement. At her door he paused, his hand cupping her cheek with infinite tenderness. "May I kiss you?" Catherine's breath caught. Everything was moving so fast, but it felt right in a way she could not fully articulate. She nodded, rising up on her toes to meet him halfway. The kiss was soft and sweet, a gentle exploration rather than a demand. Jameson's lips were warm against hers, his touch respectful even as his other arm slid around her waist to pull her closer. Catherine felt heat bloom through her body, desire mixed with affection mixed with something deeper and more profound. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "That was, I mean, you are," Jameson stammered, clearly flustered. "I should go before I forget how to behave like a gentleman." Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Come back soon." "Tomorrow if you will have me," Jameson promised, "and every day after that if you are willing." The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt both comfortable and exciting. Jameson came to Catherine's property nearly every evening after finishing his work at the ranch, helping her with the heavier chores and staying for dinner. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Catherine taught him about literature and history, while Jameson taught her about cattle ranching and tracking and reading the subtle signs of weather in the vast western sky. Word of their courtship spread through Cimarron quickly, sparking fresh rounds of gossip and speculation. Some people seemed to view it as confirmation of Catherine's moral failings, a scandal waiting to fully unfold. But others, particularly some of the younger families, began to reconsider their hasty judgments. If Jameson Parker, whose family was respected throughout the territory, believed Catherine Riley worth courting, perhaps she was not the dangerous radical they had been led to believe. 3 students whose families had withdrawn them returned to Catherine's school, their parents offering awkward apologies about overreacting. It was not a flood of support, but it was something, a small crack in the wall of disapproval. True to his word, Jameson arranged a trip to Santa Fe. They traveled together, properly chaperoned by Jameson's aunt who lived in the territorial capital, a formidable woman named Martha, who clearly adored her nephew and seemed predisposed to like anyone he cared about. The lawyer, Thomas Fitzgerald, listened to Catherine's case with sharp attention, asking pointed questions about timelines and documentation. "The railroad assumes no one will challenge them," Fitzgerald said finally, leaning back in his leather chair. "They rely on intimidation and the knowledge that most people lack resources to mount a serious legal defense. But you have documentation of your father's original purchase. You have the property clearly deeded in your name, and you have a witness to the mayor's attempts at intimidation. If you are willing to see this through, I believe we have a solid case." "What are our chances of winning?" Catherine asked, needing to understand the reality before she committed Jameson's savings to this fight. "Better than even," Fitzgerald said. "The law is actually on your side, which is not always the case in these disputes. The railroad must provide fair market compensation, and their current offer is laughably below that threshold. The question is whether you can endure the pressure they will bring to bear once you file suit. They will not take kindly to being challenged, particularly by a woman. It will get ugly." Catherine looked at Jameson, who nodded encouragingly. "It is already ugly," she said. "At least this way I fight back." They filed the lawsuit the next day. The response was immediate and harsh. The railroad's lawyers filed motions to dismiss, arguing that Catherine lacked legal standing as a woman to challenge their assessment. When that failed, they began a campaign of intimidation, spreading rumors about Catherine's character and threatening Jameson with consequences if he continued to support her. The pressure increased daily. Merchants who had begun to serve Catherine again suddenly found they could not extend her credit. Families withdrew their children from her school once more, citing pressure from their employers, many of whom had business relationships with the railroad. Anonymous letters arrived at Catherine's home, some threatening, others simply cruel. Through it all, Jameson remained steadfast. He spent more nights at Catherine's property than his own ranch, unwilling to leave her unprotected. His presence became a shield against the worst of the harassment, and his visible commitment to her cause began to shift public opinion in subtle ways. "Why are you doing this?" Catherine asked one evening as they sat on her porch watching the stars emerge. "You are losing business contracts, facing threats, all because you chose to stand with me. You could walk away from this. No one would blame you." Jameson pulled her closer against his side, his arm secure around her shoulders. "I told you before, I love you. That is not conditional on things being easy or convenient. You are fighting for something that matters, and I am honored to stand with you. Also, I should mention that half the people threatening me are cowards who would never follow through, and the other half are people whose respect I never wanted in the first place." "I love you too," Catherine said quietly. The words still felt new and slightly frightening, but also undeniably true. "I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I am grateful for you every day." "You exist," Jameson said simply. "You are brave and principled and brilliant, and you refuse to be diminished. That is enough." That is more than enough. The case wound its way through the legal system with frustrating slowness. Months passed, summer fading into autumn, autumn giving way to winter. Fitzgerald proved to be an excellent lawyer, methodically building their case while deflecting the railroad's attempts at intimidation. He brought in expert witnesses to testify about property values, produced documentation of similar cases where fair compensation had been required, and systematically dismantled every argument the railroad's lawyers presented. Through the long months of legal proceedings, Catherine and Jameson's relationship deepened. What had begun as attraction and admiration transformed into something solid and enduring, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Jameson proposed on a clear December evening, presenting Catherine with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "I know the timing is not ideal," he said, kneeling on her porch while snow fell gently around them. "We are in the middle of a legal battle, and the future is uncertain. But I am certain about you. I am certain about us. I want to build a life with you, Catherine. I want to support your teaching and your causes, to raise children who are as brave and principled as their mother, to grow old watching you change the world one stubborn fight at a time. Will you marry me?" Catherine pulled him to his feet, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes. I want all of that with you." They married in January of 1879, a small ceremony at the mission ruins with only a handful of guests. Jameson's Aunt Martha came from Santa Fe, and a few of Catherine's most loyal students attended with their families. It was not the grand celebration some might have hoped for, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Catherine wore a simple dress of ivory wool, and Jameson looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Sheriff Clayton, who turned out to be surprisingly sympathetic to their cause, officiated the ceremony. "Do you, Jameson Parker, take Catherine Riley to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" "I do," Jameson said firmly, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "For better or worse, in victory or defeat, I choose you. Always." When it was Catherine's turn, her voice was steady and clear. "I do. I choose this man who has shown me that strength and gentleness can coexist, that love does not require surrender. I choose partnership and respect and the courage to keep fighting together." The kiss they shared was witnessed by their small gathering and blessed by the vast New Mexico sky, and Catherine felt a completeness she had never experienced before. She was still herself, still fighting for her property and her students and her principles. But now she was not fighting alone. The legal battle reached its conclusion in March. The territorial judge, perhaps influenced by the couple's visible commitment to each other and their cause, or perhaps simply by the weight of evidence Fitzgerald presented, ruled in Catherine's favor. The railroad was ordered to provide fair market compensation for her property, an amount nearly 4 times their original offer. Additionally, the judge issued a broader ruling about property rights and fair compensation that would protect other small landholders in future disputes. Catherine stood in the courtroom, holding Jameson's hand, and felt vindication wash over her. It was not just about the money, though that would allow her to build a proper school. It was about the principle, about standing up and refusing to be silenced or dismissed. She had spoken her mind, had fought when fighting seemed impossible, and she had won. The response in Cimarron was mixed, but gradually shifted toward grudging respect. Some people would never forgive Catherine for her outspokenness, would always view her as a troublemaker who refused to accept her proper place. But others, particularly women who had watched her fight, began to find their own voices. Mrs. Henderson started attending town meetings and asking pointed questions about budget allocations. Senora Martinez publicly challenged the mayor about discriminatory business licensing practices. small acts of rebellion, inspired by Catherine's example. With the compensation money and Jameson's continued financial support, Catherine built a new schoolhouse on property Jameson owned adjacent to the Triple Creek Ranch. It was larger and better equipped than her previous building, with windows that let in abundant light, and a small library room filled with books shipped from Santa Fe and even further east. Students began to return, drawn by Catherine's reputation as an excellent teacher and by the implicit protection of being associated with the Parker family. Catherine discovered she was pregnant in late summer, her body changing in ways both terrifying and wonderful. Jameson was overjoyed, immediately becoming overprotective in ways that Catherine found both endearing and occasionally frustrating. He wanted her to reduce her teaching hours, to rest more, to let him handle all the heavy work around their growing ranch and school property. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Catherine reminded him gently after he tried to prevent her from carrying a stack of textbooks. "I am fully capable of teaching and managing my normal activities." "I know," Jameson said, looking slightly abashed. "I just worry. You are the most precious thing in my world, and I want to make sure you and the baby are safe." Catherine softened, pulling him down for a kiss. "We are safe. We are happy. And I need you to trust that I know my own limits and will ask for help when I need it." Their son was born in April of 1880, a healthy baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin. They named him Thomas, after the lawyer who had helped them win their case, with the middle name James after Jameson's father. Catherine had never imagined herself as a mother, had been so focused on her teaching and her independence that she had not considered the possibility. But holding Thomas, feeling the weight of this tiny person who depended on her completely, she discovered reserves of love she had not known existed. Jameson proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas during those exhausting first months, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in his rough cowboy voice. Catherine would often wake in the night to find him standing by the cradle, just watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "What are you thinking?" she asked one night, coming to stand beside him. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Jameson said quietly. "That I have a brilliant, beautiful wife who challenges me to be better every day, and a son who represents every good possibility in the world. That I cannot believe this is my life." Catherine leaned against him, watching Thomas sleep. "I feel the same way. Sometimes I think about where I was 2 years ago, alone and fighting everyone, convinced I would spend my life that way. And now I have this, have him. It still feels like a miracle." As Thomas grew, Catherine gradually returned to teaching, though on a reduced schedule that allowed her to balance motherhood with her passion for education. The school continued to grow, drawing students from increasingly distant families who appreciated both the quality of instruction and Catherine's willingness to accept children regardless of their parents' ability to pay full tuition. Jameson's ranch prospered as well, his herd growing steadily. He hired additional hands and began to establish a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. Together, they became pillars of the community in ways Catherine had never imagined possible. Their relationship, which had begun amid scandal and opposition, became something people pointed to as an example of partnership and mutual respect. In 1882, Catherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Julia Martha after Jameson's mother and his supportive aunt. Julia was smaller than Thomas had been, with dark hair and green eyes that matched Catherine's exactly. She was also considerably more vocal, making her opinions known from birth with lusty cries that could wake the entire household. "She takes after her mother," Jameson said with a laugh, walking the floor with a screaming Julia at 2 in the morning. Already speaking her mind and refusing to be silenced. "Are you complaining?" Catherine asked, amused despite her exhaustion. "Not even slightly," Jameson assured her. "I hope she grows up to be exactly like you, fierce and brave and unwilling to accept anything less than justice." Thomas, now 2 years old, proved to be a gentle and thoughtful child who loved books almost as much as his mother did. Catherine would often find him in the school's library room, carefully turning pages of picture books, making up elaborate stories about the illustrations. She began teaching him his letters before his 3rd birthday, delighted by his quick mind and genuine curiosity. The legal precedent set by Catherine's case continued to have ripples throughout the territory. Other small landholders successfully challenged unfair railroad seizures, citing the ruling in Riley versus Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. Fitzgerald, the lawyer who had represented them, took on more such cases, building a reputation as someone who fought for people without power against institutional interests. In 1884, New Mexico began discussions about eventual statehood, and Catherine found herself increasingly involved in territorial politics. She wrote articles for the Santa Fe newspaper about education reform and women's property rights, using her own case as an example of why existing laws needed strengthening. Some of her pieces were controversial, sparking angry responses from those who believed women should remain silent on political matters. But others found her arguments compelling, and gradually the conversation began to shift. Jameson supported her political involvement completely, often caring for Thomas and Julia, so Catherine could travel to Santa Fe for meetings or to speak at public forums. He never expressed resentment about the attention she received or suggested she should focus solely on domestic concerns. Instead, he seemed genuinely proud of her accomplishments, bragging to anyone who would listen about his brilliant wife and her important work. "You ever regret it?" Catherine asked him one evening as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas, now 6, was teaching 4-year-old Julia how to skip stones in the creek that ran through their property. "Marrying someone who brings so much controversy and attention, your life would be much simpler with a conventional wife." Jameson turned to look at her with genuine surprise. "Regret it, Catherine. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes, life with you is complicated sometimes, and yes, we have faced opposition and criticism. But I would rather have one day of this life married to you than a lifetime of simple contentment with someone else. You make me think, you challenge me to be better, you show our children what courage and principle look like in action. How could I possibly regret that?" Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. After 6 years of marriage, Jameson still had the ability to say exactly what she needed to hear. "I love you. I do not tell you that often enough, but I love you so much it sometimes frightens me." "I love you too," Jameson said, pulling her close. "Every stubborn, opinionated, brilliant part of you. Never stop speaking your mind, Catherine. Never stop fighting for what you believe in. It is beautiful, watching you change the world." The years continued to pass, marked by small triumphs and occasional setbacks. Catherine's school expanded again, adding a second teacher to handle the growing enrollment. Thomas proved to be a gifted student, devouring books and showing particular aptitude for mathematics. Julia was more interested in practical skills, spending hours following her father around the ranch, learning about cattle and horses and the land. In 1887, Catherine was invited to speak at a territorial education conference in Santa Fe, presenting her methods for teaching students from diverse backgrounds and economic circumstances. Her presentation was well received, and several other communities began to implement similar approaches in their own schools. She returned home to find Jameson had organized a celebration, gathering their friends and neighbors to honor her achievement. "You did not need to do this," Catherine protested, embarrassed by the attention. "Yes, I did," Jameson insisted. "You work so hard, accomplish so much, and you never take time to acknowledge your own success. Let people celebrate you, Catherine. You have earned it." Their third child, another son they named Henry after Catherine's father, was born in 1888. He was a happy, easy baby who seemed content to observe the world with wide, curious eyes. Thomas and Julia adored their new brother, competing for the privilege of holding him or making him laugh. Catherine sometimes thought about that town meeting in 1878, about standing alone before a hostile crowd and speaking truth, despite the cost. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. In many ways, she supposed it had. That frightened, isolated young woman had been transformed by love and partnership, and the knowledge that she did not have to fight every battle alone. But the core of who she was remained unchanged. She was still outspoken, still unwilling to accept injustice, still committed to using her voice on behalf of those who struggled to make themselves heard. The difference was that now she had Jameson beside her, a partner who amplified rather than diminished her strength. In 1889, the territorial legislature passed new protections for property owners facing seizure through eminent domain, requiring genuine fair market compensation and independent assessment. Catherine attended the signing ceremony, standing beside other advocates who had fought for the legislation. The territorial governor specifically acknowledged her case as instrumental in building support for the reforms. "Mrs. Parker, your willingness to stand up for your rights, even in the face of significant opposition, has made a real difference for countless families throughout New Mexico," the governor said during his remarks. "You exemplified the kind of courage and principle we need more of in our territory." Catherine accepted the acknowledgement graciously, though privately she thought about all the people who had supported her along the way. Jameson, certainly, whose love and backing had made the fight possible. Fitzgerald, the lawyer who had believed in her case. The students and families who had remained loyal, even during the darkest days. Change was never the work of one person alone, but rather the result of many people choosing to act according to their principles. That evening, back at the ranch, Jameson found her sitting on the porch long after the children had gone to bed. He settled beside her, their shoulders touching in comfortable familiarity. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Catherine said honestly. "About how far we have come, about all the fights still ahead, about our children and what kind of world they will inherit. Thomas is already asking questions about injustice and fairness. Julia announced yesterday that she does not see why only boys can be cowboys. Henry is too young for such concerns, but his turn will come." Jameson smiled. "They are your children. Of course they question everything and refuse to accept arbitrary limitations. Julia will probably be running her own ranch by the time she is 20, and Thomas will likely be a lawyer or a judge, arguing cases about constitutional rights. Henry will find his own path, something we probably cannot even imagine yet." "Does that worry you?" Catherine asked. "Having children who will challenge the world rather than simply accepting it as they find it." "Not even slightly," Jameson said firmly. "I want our children to be brave and principled, to stand up for what is right even when it is hard. You taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That is the legacy I want to leave, not wealth or land or even the ranch, but children who know how to fight for justice." Catherine leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I could not have done any of this without you. You know that, right? When everyone else wanted me to be smaller and quieter and more convenient, you told me I was beautiful exactly as I was. You gave me the courage to keep fighting." "You always had that courage," Jameson corrected gently. "I just recognized it and refused to let you forget it when things got hard. You would have kept fighting with or without me, Catherine. It is who you are." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge over the New Mexico landscape they both loved. After more than a decade of marriage, Catherine still felt grateful every day for this man who had defended her in a saloon meeting and never stopped supporting her since. Their love had been tested by opposition and hardship, by the challenges of building a life together in an unforgiving landscape, but it had only grown stronger and deeper with time. The years continued their steady march forward. Thomas left for university in 1896, heading east to study law as his father had predicted. He wrote long letters home, sharing his studies and his growing passion for civil rights law. Julia, now 14, had indeed become an accomplished horsewoman and ranch manager, working alongside Jameson with easy competence. Henry, at 8, showed artistic talent, filling notebooks with detailed drawings of the landscape and wildlife around their property. Catherine continued teaching, though she gradually transitioned more administrative duties to her younger colleague as her own energy waned slightly. She was nearly 40 now, still vigorous and engaged, but beginning to feel the accumulation of decades of hard work. Her hair had begun to show threads of silver, and fine lines creased the corners of her eyes. She thought she had never been more beautiful, and Jameson told her so frequently. In 1898, Catherine published a book about educational methods for rural schools, drawing on her 20 years of experience teaching in New Mexico. The book found a modest but devoted audience among educators throughout the West, and she began to receive invitations to speak at conferences and training sessions across the region. Jameson accompanied her on these trips when he could, proud to watch his wife share her knowledge and experience with appreciative audiences. Their ranch had become one of the most successful in the territory, not through aggressive expansion, but through careful management and fair dealing. Jameson employed a diverse workforce, including Mexican vaqueros and several former slaves who had made their way west after the Civil War. He paid fair wages and treated his employees with respect, building loyalty that translated into superior work and minimal turnover. Thomas returned from university in 1900 with his law degree, and immediately began working with Fitzgerald, the lawyer who had represented his mother 2 decades earlier. Together, they took on cases involving property rights, civil liberties, and discrimination, building on the precedents established by Catherine's original case against the railroad. Julia announced in 1902 that she intended to run the ranch full-time, with no interest in marriage or children. "I love this land," she told her parents firmly. "I want to devote my life to building something here, to conservation and sustainable practices. I do not need a husband to do that." Catherine felt a fierce pride in her daughter's certainty and independence. "Then that is exactly what you should do. Your father and I will support whatever path makes you happy." Jameson agreed wholeheartedly, already making plans to gradually transition ranch management to Julia while remaining available for guidance and support. "She has better instincts than I did at her age," he told Catherine. "The land will be in excellent hands." Henry surprised everyone by announcing his intention to become a photographer, a new technology that was beginning to capture people's imaginations. He wanted to document the changing West, to preserve images of the landscape and people before modernization transformed everything. It was an unusual choice, but Catherine and Jameson supported it, recognizing in their youngest child the same stubborn determination that had characterized both their lives. In 1906, New Mexico was still working toward statehood, though the path had proven longer and more complicated than early advocates had hoped. Catherine, now 50, remained active in territorial politics, writing and speaking about issues she cared about. Her voice carried weight now, the voice of someone who had fought real battles and won real victories, someone whose opinions were grounded in decades of experience rather than abstract theory. Jameson turned 51 that year, his hair now fully silver, his face deeply lined from decades under the New Mexico sun. He still rose early every morning to work the ranch, still moved with the easy competence of someone completely at home in his environment. He still looked at Catherine with the same love and admiration he had shown 28 years earlier when he defended her in a saloon meeting. "You remember that day?" Catherine asked him one evening as they celebrated their anniversary. "When you told me never to stop speaking my mind." "Every detail," Jameson confirmed. "You were standing in front of that hostile crowd, refusing to back down despite everyone shouting at you. You were magnificent. You are still magnificent every single day." "We built something good," Catherine said, looking around at their home, thinking about their children and the life they had created together. "Something that mattered." "We did," Jameson agreed. "And we are not finished yet. There are still fights to fight, causes to support, changes to make. As long as we are breathing, we can make a difference." They continued that pattern for years to come, remaining active and engaged even as age gradually slowed their pace. Thomas became a prominent civil rights lawyer, eventually arguing cases before territorial and then state Supreme Courts. Julia transformed the ranch into a model of sustainable practices, her methods studied and replicated by other ranchers throughout the region. Henry's photographs gained national recognition, his images of the changing West appearing in magazines and galleries across the country. Catherine lived to see New Mexico achieve statehood in 1912, a moment of triumph she had worked toward for decades. She and Jameson stood in the crowd at the celebration in Santa Fe, now in their 50s, surrounded by their children and growing number of grandchildren. Thomas had eventually married and had 2 daughters. Julia remained single but had adopted a young girl whose family had died in an influenza outbreak. Henry had married a photographer he met in San Francisco, and they traveled together documenting the American West. "We did it," Catherine whispered to Jameson as the new state flag was raised. "We actually did it." "You did it," Jameson corrected. "You and all the other people who refused to accept things as they were, who kept fighting even when fighting seemed impossible. I am proud to have stood beside you." Catherine took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "I could never have done any of it without you. You gave me the courage to keep speaking up, to keep fighting, to keep believing that one voice could matter. You taught me that love does not require surrender, that partnership means supporting each other to become more fully themselves." They lived for many more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, continuing to advocate for causes they believed in even as their bodies grew frailer. Jameson died peacefully in 1925 at the age of 70, surrounded by his family in the home he had built with Catherine. His last words were addressed to his wife of 46 years. "Never stop speaking your mind," he whispered, echoing the words he had spoken so many decades earlier. "It is still beautiful. You are still beautiful." Catherine lived another 3 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She died in 1928 at 72, In the schoolhouse that bore her name, surrounded by books and students, and the legacy of a lifetime spent fighting for education and justice. Her funeral drew people from across New Mexico, former students and fellow advocates and community leaders who credited her with inspiring their own activism. Thomas delivered the eulogy, speaking about his mother's courage and principle, about her refusal to be silenced despite constant pressure to conform. "My mother taught me that speaking truth to power is not just a right but a responsibility," he said. "She showed me through her example that one person, armed with conviction and courage, can change the world. She showed all of us what it means to live with integrity, to fight for justice even when the cost is high, to never surrender your voice or your values for the sake of convenience or acceptance." Julia spoke about Catherine's love for the land and her students, about her ability to see potential in everyone regardless of their circumstances. Henry displayed photographs he had taken over the years, images of Catherine teaching, writing, speaking at rallies, holding her grandchildren, laughing with Jameson on their porch. Together, they painted a picture of a woman who had lived fully and authentically, who had refused to be diminished, who had loved deeply and fought bravely until the very end. They buried Catherine beside Jameson on a hill overlooking the ranch and school they had built together, with a view of the vast New Mexico landscape they had both loved. The inscription on their shared headstone was simple: "They stood together and changed the world." Years later, historians would point to Catherine Riley Parker as an important figure in the fight for women's rights and educational reform in the American West. Her lawsuit against the railroad became a landmark case studied in law schools. Her educational methods were adopted throughout the region and beyond. Her writings influenced generations of teachers and advocates, but perhaps her most important legacy was simpler and more personal. She showed countless people, particularly women, that it was possible to speak up, to fight back, to refuse to accept injustice. She demonstrated that having a voice and using it was not selfish or unfeminine, but essential and beautiful. And she proved that love and partnership could exist without requiring surrender, that the right person would celebrate your strength rather than trying to diminish it. The schoolhouse she founded continued operating for decades, eventually becoming part of the New Mexico public school system. A scholarship fund was established in her name, supporting students who demonstrated both academic promise and commitment to social justice. Her great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren continued the family traditions of advocacy and service, carrying forward the values she and Jameson had instilled. The ranch remained in the family as well, managed by Julia's adopted daughter and her descendants, still operating according to the sustainable practices Julia had pioneered. It became a teaching ranch, hosting students and aspiring ranchers who wanted to learn methods that honored the land rather than exploiting it. In the small museum that was eventually established in Cimarron to preserve the town's history, a special exhibit honored Catherine and Jameson Parker. It included her books and writings, photographs of the school and ranch, copies of the legal documents from her lawsuit, and letters they had written to each other over their decades together. The centerpiece was a large photograph from their 25th anniversary, showing them standing together on their porch, Catherine's hand in Jameson's, both smiling at the camera with expressions of contentment and enduring love. Beside the photograph, a placard quoted Jameson's words from that long-ago saloon meeting: "Never stop speaking your mind. It is beautiful." Underneath, it added Catherine's response from her memoir published shortly before her death: "He meant it, and he never stopped meaning it." That changed everything. Their story became part of the larger narrative of the American West, a testament to the possibility of partnership and progress, of love that empowered rather than constrained, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply by refusing to accept injustice. It was a story of courage and conviction, of standing together against overwhelming odds, of building something lasting and meaningful through dedication and mutual respect. And at its heart, it was a love story, simple and profound, about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to spend their lives amplifying each other's voices, celebrating each other's strengths, and building a legacy that would outlast them both. They had taken a moment of conflict and transformation and turned it into a lifetime of partnership and purpose, proving that love and justice were not opposing forces but complementary ones, each making the other stronger and more meaningful. Their descendants carried that knowledge forward, generation after generation, creating ripples that spread far beyond anything Catherine and Jameson could have imagined when they first met in that crowded saloon in 1878. They had changed the world not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms alone, but through the daily choice to stand together, to support each other's growth, to believe that every voice mattered and every act of courage contributed to a more just future. In the end, that was their truest legacy, more valuable than property or position or public recognition. They had shown that it was possible to live with integrity and love, to fight for what mattered without sacrificing what was precious, to build a life of meaning and purpose together. They had demonstrated that speaking truth and standing firm were not acts of selfishness but expressions of the deepest respect, both for oneself and for the possibility of a better world. And they had proved, beyond any doubt, that there was profound beauty in refusing to be silenced, in using your voice regardless of the cost, in standing up for justice, even when standing up meant standing alone. At least until you found the person who would stand beside you, not to speak for you, but to ensure your voice carried further and stronger, echoing across the years and inspiring others to find their own courage and their own voices, creating a chorus of change that could not be ignored or silenced, no matter how hard the forces of complacency and injustice might try.